Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and I'm going to take us back into history a bit and reviewing this book published in 1915, Pathfinders of the Great Plains, a chronicle of La Vérendrye and his sons by Lawrence Burnaby. I kid you not. And this is basically, I've spent some time speaking about Hudson's Bay Company, Rupert's Land. This is about the French side, the French fur traders, and this is one in particular. And why I'm using this to illustrate something is, well, you'll see, I don't want to spoil it. It's quite clever how Indigenous nationals deal with non-native people. And there's quite an example here, with quite serious consequences. This man was born in a quaint little town of Three Rivers on the St. Lawrence on November 17, 1685. His father was governor of the district of which Three Rivers was the capital, and his mother was a daughter of so-and-so, a former governor of the same district. So he comes from quite the family, if you will. As a boy at Three Rivers, he had enjoyed many chances of meeting the fur traders who came down to the little town on the St. Lawrence with their packs of valuable peltry, and had shown an especial and fascinated interest in their stories of the boundless country that lay north and west of the string of settlements on the St. Lawrence. This country was so vast in extent that even the most remote tribes yet visited by the white traders could state nothing definite as to its outer boundaries, though in answer to the eager questions of the white men, they invented many untrue tales about it. Well, how did they know it was untrue? Why would Indigenous nationals be compelled to share a bunch of information about their country? It really was a matter, how did that relate to trade between natives and non-natives at the time? The fur traders themselves were divided into two classes. The more staid and respectable class built trading forts in the interior on the borders of territories occupied by the Indians. Here they kept a supply of the things required by the natives: guns, powder and balls, tobacco, blankets, bright-colored cotton, axes and small tools, flints and steels, vermilion for war paint, and beads of every color and description. The Indians brought their furs into the forts and bartered them for the goods that they needed. Sometimes, with no sense of real values, they traded beaver skins and other pelts of high worth for a piece of gaudy cotton, a little vermilion, or a handful of beads. The white men, of course, brought things which rapidly became indispensable to the Indians, whose native bows and arrows and hatchets of stone seemed almost useless compared to the muskets and the steel axes brought from Europe. To acquire these things became vital to the Indians. So this is how, of course, changed lifestyle. And the traders who now supplied them acquired each year thousands of beautiful furs. These were tied up securely into packs and carried in canoes down to Montreal or Three Rivers, where they were bought by the great merchants and sent by ship to France. The furs that had been bought from the Indian for a mere trifle fetched hundreds of francs when they finally reached Paris. And you still see this today in a lot of business dealings. Just because there's a lack of experience with the value of something, because it's so different from what is valuable to Indigenous nationals, it doesn't mean to say that they're not astute traders. For them, the furs were abundant. It was easy to get. There wasn't a huge demand because everybody could do this. So the items that were considered not so important or not so valuable were indeed valuable to the Indians, right? The second class of traders, known as the woodrunners, were very different from the first. Speaking generally, they were young men, sometimes of good family, who found life in the older towns and settlements prosaic and uninteresting, and when they went to the interior did not care to be tied down to the humdrum existence of the trading forts. Instead of requiring the Indians to bring their furs down to some fort, these enterprising rovers of the forest went into the Indian country. Sometimes they took light trading goods with them to barter with them for furs, but oftener they themselves hunted and trapped the beaver, the otter, and the fox. They were generally men of reckless courage, ready to face danger and hardship. For long living among the Indians, they themselves became in time half Indian. There's a different word that's used, so I'm substituting. Some of them took Indian wives and were adopted into the tribes. So this example, when you're adopted into the tribe, it doesn't make you a Métis. You're actually a national of that Indigenous nation There's the distinction that I've talked about previously. In particular, in the Northwest Territories and in the North generally, this is what transpired, as opposed to leaving those communities and setting up their own business structures, which of course did happen. So as this young man is experiencing life, one day, according to his own story, this particular Indian who visited had traveled far towards the setting sun until he came to a great lake out of which a river flowed westward. He said that he had paddled down this river until he reached a point where the water ebbed and flowed. Through fear of the tribes that inhabited the shores of the river, he had not gone to its mouth. But he had been told that the river emptied into a great salt lake or sea, upon the coasts of which dwelt men of terrifying mien, who lived in fortified towns. He had been told that these men wore armor and rode on horseback, and that great ships visited the towns which they had built on the coasts. Now this made a deep impression on La Vérendrye. The river that flowed westward and fell into the great sea answered so closely to his own dream of exploration and seemed on the whole so probable that he was persuaded of the truth of the story. He determined therefore to surrender his command of a post and equip an expedition for the discovery of the Western Sea, which now seemed to be within comparatively easy reach. To do this, he would have to obtain permission and support of the Governor General of Canada. And he said, and remember, this is a French colony, and therefore set out for Quebec, taking his map with him to point out the path intended. The governor at Quebec was keenly interested in these plans for Western discovery and wrote immediately to the French king, urging that he should be provided with 100 men and the necessary supplies and equipment. But King Louis at the time was deeply engaged in European wars and intrigues and could not spare any money for the work of exploration. All that he would grant was a monopoly of the Western fur trade. So remember how England granted the Hudson's Bay Company a monopoly of trade. Well, here France, the King of France, has done the same with his subject. And that is to say, La Vérendrye was to be allowed to build trading forts in the country which he was about to explore, and out of the profits of his traffic with the Indians, he might pay the cost of his expedition to the Western Sea. So engage in trading and cover your own costs to do your exploration. No other French traders would be permitted to trade in this part of the country. Now, this was disappointing for him, but he set about trying to outfit himself. And so, since the king had not paid that up, he said, well, he needs to have men. He must have canoes, provisions, and goods to trade with the natives. All this demanded a good deal of money. He devoted at once to the cause his own little fortune, but this was far from sufficient. So off he went to Montreal to plead with its merchants to help him. The merchants, however, were not much interested in his plans for Western discovery. They were businessmen without patriotism. They looked for something that would bring profit, not for what might advance the interests of their country. So it turns out that he said he was shrewd, and he spoke to the merchants in the terms that they would understand. In other words, he didn't push the exploration, but he said this. He said he decided he could turn the king's monopoly to good account. Give me money to pay my men, he said, and goods to trade with the Western tribes, and I will bring you rich returns in beaver skins. No other traders are permitted to go into the country west of Lake Superior. I will build trading forts there, and from these, as a base, I will continue my search for the Western Sea. All the profits of the enterprise, the rich furs that are brought into my posts, shall be yours. Now, here was something that the self-seeking merchants could understand. They saw in the fur trading monopoly a chance of a golden harvest, a return of hundreds for every franc that they advanced towards the expenses of the undertaking. And so he convinced them to support this. Now, on the day of La Vérendrye leaving on his expedition, there was a lot of commotion going on, and it says that his departure was watched with varied and conflicting emotions. In the crowd that surrounded him were friends and enemies. Some who openly applauded his design, others who less openly scoffed at it, priests exhorting him to devote all his energies to furthering the missionary aims of their church among the wild tribes of the West. Jealous traders commenting among themselves upon the injustice involved in granting a monopoly of the western fur trade to this scheming adventurer. Partners in the enterprise anxiously watching the loading of the precious merchandise they had advanced to him and wondering whether their cast of the dice would bring fortune or failure. Busybodies bombarding him with advice, and a crowd of idle onlookers divided in their minds as to whether La Vérendrye would return triumphantly from the western sea, laden with the spoils of Cathay and Cipango, or would fall victim to the half-human monsters that were reputed to inhabit the wilderness of the West. So in terms of time frames, this is in the 1700s. I forgot to mention that. So it's around 1731, for instance. Now, he had his sons with him. He had 3 of them. And at one point, it was necessary for his son and to take a few others to go out and secure some food that they needed. So off they went. And as they were camped by the lake and quite disarmed, if you will, literally, there came a fleet of canoes manned by 100 quote-unquote savages, the fierce and implacable Sioux of the prairie. They had reached the Lake of the Woods by way of a stream that bore the significant name the Road of War. This was the warpath of the Sioux from their own country, south of what is now the province of Manitoba, to the country of the Chippewas and the Crees further east. Whenever the Sioux followed this route, they were upon no peaceful errand. As the Sioux entered the lake, a mist was rising slowly, but before it completely hid their canoes, keen-sighted savage saw the 3 canoes of the French, who were about to land on the far side of an island out in the lake. Cautiously, the Sioux felt their way across the near side of the island and landed unperceived. They glided noiselessly through the thick underbrush, and as they approached the other shore, crept from tree to tree, finally wriggling snake-wise to the very edge of the thicket. So very keen and astute warriors. Beneath them lay a narrow beach on which some of the voyageurs had built a fire to prepare the morning meal. Others lay about smoking, chatting, idling, etc. All their weapons had been left on the canoes, so they didn't have access to that. And there's quite a lot of detail as to what transpired with the Sioux attacking them. It's quite a brutal description. For some time it was not known why the Sioux had made an attack, seemingly unprovoked, upon the French. Gradually, however, it leaked out that earlier in the year a party of Sioux on their way to Fort St. Charles on a friendly visit had been fired upon by a party of Chippewas. The Sioux had shouted indignantly, "Who fire on us?" And the Chippewas, in ambush, had yelled back with grim humor, "The French!" The Sioux retreated, vowing a terrible vengeance against the treacherous white men. Their opportunity came when they came across a white trader named Bourassa, and as he camped for the night on the banks of the Rainy River. The following morning, as he was about to push off from the shore, he was surrounded by 30 canoes manned by 100 Sioux. They bound him hand and foot, tied him to a stake, and were about to burn him alive when a Sioux maiden, fortunately for him, his companion had been Sioux, and she had been captured by a war party of Monsones some years before and rescued from them by this man. She knew of the projected journey of the son of La Vérendrye. "My kinship," she now cried, "what are you about to do? I owe my life to this Frenchman. He has done nothing but good to me. Why should you destroy him? If you wish to be revenged for the attack made upon you, go forward, and you will meet 24 Frenchmen, and with whom is the son of the chief who killed your people." Now, Bourassa was too frightened to oppose this statement. In his own account of what happened, he is indeed careful to omit any mention of this particular incident. The Sioux released Bourassa after taking possession of his arms and supplies. Then they paddled down to the lake, where they were only too successful in finding the French and in making them the victims of the cruel joke of the Chippewas. This explorer lost his son, And before leaving the country, he buried on the summit of a hill a tablet of lead with the arms and inscription of the French king. This was to take possession of the country for France. He also built a pyramid of stones in honor of the governor of Canada. So sometimes it's not planting of a flag, sometimes it's burying a tablet of lead, it appears, in terms of what was necessary in order to take possession of the country of someone else. But my point, what is my point in sharing this detailed story? Well, it's kind of similar today, the pointing the finger at someone else. What brings to mind for me are all these lawyers who've made millions and millions of dollars taking forward cases under Section 35 doctrine, the domestic doctrine of Aboriginal rights. And when things don't improve, in fact, don't really pan out, these same lawyers will say, oh, well, Canada's not following the law. When the reality is that Canada is, yes, following the law. The problem is what the law is. And these lawyers, if they didn't know, they ought to have known. And to point the finger elsewhere at their own, if you will, misdeeds. I mean, it's not a misdeed in the sense that that doctrine's there and any lawyer is, of course, permitted to rely on it and use it. But if they are suggesting that that Section 35 doctrine is something that it's not, then that's a misdeed. That's not properly advising your client. And the only answer, when all of the evidence has been made very, very clear what Section 35 is, these same lawyers have told their Indigenous clients to say, oh, it's not the problem with my lawsuit. It's not the problem with us relying on Section 35. The problem is the government of Canada is not respecting the law. Well, I'm one of the first to point out that Canada is an outlaw nation, but it is not with respect to following a doctrine that people will willingly go beneath. And this reminds me of how the pointing and deflecting of the attention as to what went wrong and who is responsible, how much that continues today. And that's all I have to say.